Hello, I'm Squid Pizza, and I play Commander. When I play Commander, my friends sometimes ask, "Gee, Squid, you build really cool decks and are really smart and attractive. How can we learn to build Commander decks like you?" So this is for you, friends. Although this video is about a specific deck, I want to hopefully get you thinking about all kinds of strategies, and how you can take what I've learned and apply it in ways I couldn't imagine. Like almost all decks I make, this is a budget list, and at the time of making this video, every card is under $1. Any card that is not under $1 is immediately disqualified from being included. Aside from me being cheap, I think building this way requires a lot of thoughtfulness in a way that I enjoy, but that's probably a better topic for a different video. If you're wondering who this is, it's Midas, a character from a story I'm writing. I made this little VTuber a few months ago, and I really wanted to finally use it for something. Anyhow, let's get into the actual video. Every commander has a few questions to answer. Let's start with, what does it want to do? Part of this is how it wins, but another part is, let's call it satisfaction. If your gets to do its thing and still loses, is it enjoyable? Even the best decks won't win every game, but making sure your deck still gets to do its thing will help make losses fun. The second question that leads to the first is, how do we get there? What cards and synergies lead to our deck doing its thing? What stops it? Can our commander help us get to it? This is the third question. What does your commander specifically encourage, and what does it provide? If you think of every commander as a function, where you input one game action to get some reward, you can holistically examine what the deck may want to build towards. Let's really break down our example commander here. Emmara is a 2-mana 2/2 with exactly one line of text, which is pretty refreshing, I think. Whenever Emmara becomes tapped, you create a 1/1 soldier with lifelink. She's also an elf cleric, which isn't really relevant. Really, she might as well be a salamander or something for how much it matters, with exactly one exception. Emmara encourages tapping and provides creature tokens.
Hello.
She's also very cheap at only 2 mana. This is really important because it means we'll start every game with a turn 2 play. I really want to emphasize this point. We always have a turn 2 play every game. This means that we can worry less about strong turn 2 options and focus on powerful turn 3 and 4 plays. This is Emmara's real strength, I think. Consistency is very powerful, and we can virtually guarantee that on turn 3 we'll have Emmara and a soldier token. Even though there are commanders who can do powerful things on turn 5 or 6, Emmara would have been doing her thing for multiple turns already. So how can we tap Emmara? The simplest answer is through attacking. This is easy enough to do on the first few turns before players have threatening blockers. Emmara on her own is not extremely worth retreating in for, or using a removal spell, especially since we get the token ahead of blocks. If you dislike the experience of your bomb commanders getting instantly removed, you can consider cheaper, self-contained, value over time options like Emmara or Zoyoa Lavaton, another deck I've built and really enjoy. Zoyoa is built around a very similar philosophy to this deck, in fact, being a deck that gets its main engine online turn 2 and then coasts on that early power. It's designed to be resilient, efficient, and always impactful, just like I want Emmara to be. Anyway, in the mid to late game though, Emmara's cheapness becomes a disadvantage. Without buffs, it's hard to reliably attack with it. This is where tapping as cost effects come in, and the demand for it shapes much of our deck construction. In a sense, this presents a point of divergence. We can either focus more heavily on attacking with more evasion effects or modifications that increase her power, or we can focus more on using her as tap using vehicles, spacecraft, and so on. My current build of the deck tries to split the difference, although it leans slightly more heavily into tap effects. Having multiple avenues of synergy increases resilience and helps keep every game from feeling samey. The other thing that shapes our deck construction is Emmara's output, 1/1 life-linking soldiers. Because Emmara is so cheap and reliable to trigger, we can assume that we'll get one every turn cycle, so long as Emmara is in play. A deck focused around Emmara probably wants to play a go-wide strategy, summoning lots of small creatures and using anthem effects to make them threatening. It's probably going to win by turning a wide board of small creatures into big beaters. And indeed, this is how my Emmara decks tend to win. So let's circle this as our goal. We want to make a wide board of small creatures and use anthem effects to make them threatening. Emmara helps with one of those, making small creatures. However, while she's cheap and efficient, she also doesn't scale super well, and it's unreliable to get more than one token turns. This is the trade-off we make for such a low cost, and other go-wide commanders such as Decklists, Revelant Medium, or Zergo, Thunder's Decree, have higher potential dividends in exchange for lower consistency. Remember, every commander has strengths and weaknesses. Even the best commanders in the game have trade-offs. Zergo may make more tokens per turn, but he has to attack. On turn 4, Emmara and Zergo will have made the same number of tokens total. And by turn 6, Emmara will have likely made about as many tokens as Decklists, while being 3 mana cheaper. Let's examine what actually leads to our desired game state. We'll need token generators and payoffs for making tokens. We'll also need anthem effects to make them powerful. Since Emmara wants to tap to make tokens, we'll consider effects that tap our creatures and other creatures that want to tap. Before getting too deeply into all of that though, we need to take a look at our mana base. It's a necessary foundation to building a functioning deck. Since Emmara is a 2-color, 2-mana commander, we can't really afford to play any colorless lands with a few exceptions. We really want to hit her on turn 2 every single game. This means that cards that would otherwise be great for our gameplay, such as Arc of Orazca or Grove of the Guardian, will not be making the cut. Lands that require tapping creatures, such as Holdout Settlement or Command Bridge, also don't work here for similar reasons. Instead, we want utility lands that can unconditionally tap for either green or white mana, such as Castle Ardenvale, Restless Prairie, and Calney Garden. We also run several lands that have additional functionality from the hand, the Adventure lands from the Final Fantasy set, and 3 Cycling lands that turn excess land draws into other valuable effects. 3 other notable lands are Guildmage's Forum, Opal Palace, and Study Hall. These cards help keep Emmara on par when she's recast, and are the exception to the no colorless lands rule, since they can be used on turn 3 for a buffed Emmara without compensating too much on our curve. This deck also runs Tree of Tales and Artifact Land for reasons I'll discuss later. This deck doesn't run a lot of direct ramp, since our commander will almost always come down on turn 2, and we don't need to waste time on ramping to it. Instead, we can focus on always having lands to play, as this will go further in the long game than cheap mana rocks will. By this I mean, all else being equal, it's better in the mid to late game to top deck lands instead of ramp. We can use an example. Player A and Player B both have 4 lands going into their turn 5. Player A draws Rampant Growth, and Player B's draw, Snow-Covered Island. Neither player had any lands in hand on turn 5. In order to get to 5 mana, Player A has to pay a 2-mana premium to get the same amount of mana next turn as Player B, and Player B can use their mana immediately. In effect, Player A has lost 3 mana over Player B, 2 from casting the spell, and 1 from not having the land be useful immediately. If we swap Rampant Growth for Arcane Signet, and Snow-Covered Island for Dimir Guildgate, you still don't come out on par. These one-shot ramp effects are only good if you're also hitting land drops. Otherwise, they're worse than tap lands. 2-drops, like Glory Heath Lynx and House Cartographer, are making sure we hit our early land drops. In fact, Glory Heath Lynx is one of the only cards in the deck I recommend playing on turn 2 over Emmara, instead casting Emmara turn 3 to saddle. The strongest of these effects, though, is Path of Discovery. While in having multiple creatures enter in a turn cycle, I suggest binning almost everything that isn't a land. This deck does run a few ramp cards, though, particularly 3-mana ones that synergize with Emmara, such as the dynamic duo of Viewpoint Synchronization and Spider-Man, Brooklyn Visionary. Other standouts include Lumbering Worldwagon and the Regalia, vehicles that both ramp on attack. Now that we have a good idea of how our mana flows, we can break down what the deck wants to do with all that. Emmara makes 1 token at a time repeatedly, instead of several tokens in one shot. This means a few things. We benefit more from effects that care about consistent creature token generation spread out over each turn, such as Spider UK or Queen Alana of Ruda. Because Emmara is limited in her token production, we can look at supplementary effects. If you like, these could focus more on burst token effects, like increasing devotion to have more immediate impact. But I choose to play more repeatable sources of bodies, another point of diversion worth considering. A few of these play into our tapping theme also: Selesnya Evangel, Sprouts One, and Defiant Survivor, even though it technically doesn't need tokens. There are also a good number of ways to tap creatures, and creatures that benefit from being tapped. Because this is more of a cost than an output effect, these cover a wider range of effects, such as card draw, removal, and ranked, as we previously discussed. We also have a handful of creatures that benefit from being tapped, like the excellent Rip Spawn Hunter. This deck runs at minimum 10 cards that I consider to be Anthem effects, plus a handful of other ways to boost the power of creatures at various points along the curve. At 2 mana, we have cards like Anthem of Champions and Lumen-class Frigate, and further along we have really strong powerhouses like Starlight Spectacular and Commander's Insignia. Because Anthems do nothing on an empty board, they run the risk of getting stuck on our hand if we have no board to buff. They take up most of our deck's budget for do-nothing effects, and so we can't really spare much else. While cards like Harvest Season and Kadira, Caller of the Small, can potentially be extremely potent amplifiers, because they're so dependent on other cards, they compound our risk of dead draws and are mostly avoided. Instead, we can look at cards that do similar useful things without risking being dead draws. Outside of my budget, you can also look at Anthem effects that aren't totally dead, such as Dollmaker's Shot, Slash, or Silly Outlet. Instead, we want our cards to occupy a midpoint between resilient and disposable. Since we lean on Anthems to make them threatening, the majority of our creatures can afford to generate card advantage. A few of we discussed include House Cartographer and Spider UK. While these cards don't draw in quite the same way, the actual way card advantage is generated doesn't really matter, only that card advantage is happening. Augur of Autumn is solid without any setup. Rumor Gatherer is better when it's enabled, and Mighty Servant of Luke Ko is even better if its condition is met, although it's a little bit more difficult to enable. This is something you can really consider in every deck. What cards perform poorly in what situations? What cards have higher floors but lower ceilings? If you're building a Spellslinger deck that keeps your cards functioning, what cards win you the game, and what cards might hold you back if you're drawing them at inappropriate times. What if you're playing Reanimator, or a dedicated combo deck? While some players don't care for tutors at all, I like tutors with fairly specific requirements, and therefore need to be built in. Delivery Booble and Caradora, Heart of Alakria, are both 4-mana creatures that tutor upon entering the battlefield. Delivery Booble can hit cards like Lumen-class Frigate, Idol of Oblivion, and The Land, Tree of Tales, as I previously talked about. Caradora has a smaller pool of targets in this deck, but each of its cards have very high impact, like Lumbering Worldwagon and Mighty Servant of Luke Ko. Finally, protection and removal. To understand what reactive tools you need to understand what stops your deck, what forces an answer failure, what can your deck safely ignore, or let someone else deal with. While Propaganda is really powerful against this deck, it's not so good against Voltron decks that attack with one creature at a time. Thalia, Guardian of the Thraben, on the other hand, is at best mildly annoying for us, but can ruin Spellslinger decks. This deck, as a go-wide one, has a few key strengths. Single target removal is of very limited use against us, because no individual creatures are vital to our gameplay. Our enchantments are slightly more vulnerable, as they are what makes our creatures threatening, but not every deck can deal with them, especially on Moss. Having a bunch of creatures also means it's naturally good at holding off offense for non-evasive threats. It's very hard to punch a hole through 4 or 5 tutus without extra evasion. On the other hand, this deck has 2 main weaknesses. Board wipes, for obvious reasons, and ironically, other wide boards that can stem our own aggression. This means that, yes, this deck counters itself, and the best way to beat that counter is with its own board wipes. Another really annoying thorn in the deck's side is defensive enchantments, like Ghostly Prison, Propaganda, or Revenge of Ravens. While it's not immediately as devastating as a wipe, they're still really problematic, and having answers to these is very important. Creatures that can block ours in the early to mid-game are also an issue, such as other large bodies and Death Touch blockers. The final issue I've run into quite a bit is large evasive creatures. Big flyers in particular are really difficult for this deck to deal with, so this is another thing we can look out for. This deck also runs at least 4 protection spells, most of which serve a function beyond keeping our wipes at bay. For direct removal, remember what troubles this deck. Enchantments, flyers, big creatures, and wide boards are all on our hit list. Anything that could hit more than one of those in particular is really worth looking at. To that end, our removal suite includes cards like Thraben Charm and Collective Effort that can hit many different types of card. Cards that deal with a threat and leave behind bodies, such as Pest Infestation, and wipes like By Invitation Only and Phyrexian Rebirth, which can clear through wide boards and leave us something behind. Blurring the line between removal and protection, most commander decks completely ignore combat tricks. It is extremely foolish to dismiss tricks out of hand if your strategy relies on attacking. That said, this deck only runs a few, since there's not a lot of focus on protecting individual creatures. Combat tricks are so underrated that literally no commander player will ever see them coming unless you're explicitly playing a combat trick deck. It's very easy to surprise a player and get a lot of value out of a cheap trick, and once you've done so, every player will be afraid to call your bluff forever. In my local playgroup, I've gotten so many free attacks that I shouldn't have, because my friends know me as the combat trick. If you become your playgroup's combat trick guy, your friends will have no choice but to fear and respect you. Moving to the other end of the spectrum in terms of removal, Nullmane Shepherd and Glare of Shadow are two powerful removal options that can exert a ton of pressure on opponents and also act as excellent tap-out links. While these can be very oppressive, unlike most removal in this deck, they're very reliant on already having a board, which is a real downside. These definitely skew more towards do-nothing effects, but both are so strong that they can genuinely win you the game from a leading position, and so they're worth thinking about. Finally, I want to take a moment to talk about cards that aren't in this deck. Firstly, Soul Ring. I do not like Soul Ring. I refuse to play it in any of my budget decks, and I think it's especially egregious in this list, where its chief advantage is having a consistent turn 2 commander. This objectively makes the deck weaker, but I would rather not play commander than play with Soul Ring. Two cards that were in previous versions of this deck but I've waffled on for gameplay reasons are Azuri's Predation and Watchful Radstone. Azuri's Predation ended up swapped with very similar Phyrexian Rebirth as a wipe that leaves behind bodies. I was not a fan of how trivially it could completely turn a game around, and it invalidated a lot of the fun of the deck, which is about building up resources over time. Watchful Radstone had a similar issue, in that it was so strong that it ended up dominating when it stuck, and it demanded an immediate answer, which undercuts a key strength of this deck, which is that it has very few key must-remove threats. And this can only be answered after it's spiraled by a board wipe, which this deck is already very vulnerable to. Two more general categories of card are also not in this list: untap effects and power 2 or less effects. Untap effects are great if you already have an engine online, which means having a creature worth tapping, an effect that allows you to tap it, and more reasons to tap it again afterward. This is just way too much setup for a nice but very inessential effect. Power 2 or less effects are mainly out because this deck is so heavily built with anthems. In an ideal situation, they just never trigger and are therefore wasted space. They can be fine early, but there are already tons of good options for card advantage that don't stop functioning later. That's pretty much everything I wanted to cover. In the description, you'll see a version of this list that I've talked about, and another version that will be updated over time if you'd like to compare. There are a lot of sources for sound effects, images, and music that I'd like to acknowledge, and they'll be on the right-hand side of the screen right now. This is my first time doing anything like this, so I really want to thank you for watching. I hope you can get something out of what I've learned making this deck, and you can apply it to your own deck building. If this video inspires a deck, please feel free to share it in the comments. I'd be immensely flattered to see it. With that, I'm signing off. Catch you all on the flip side.